Okay, so this is a question from Cavan, who asks, who do you think will succeed Rishi Sunak as leader of the Conservative Party?
So, Rachel, you've actually been working on a piece about this, haven't you? So what names are coming up as you're working on this?
The names that come up repeatedly are Kemi Badenoch, Penny Mordant, Suella Braverman.
Right.
But there are others that you wouldn't necessarily rule out, like James Cleverly. And obviously, if you ever look at the list of cabinet ministers who Conservative Party members believe are doing the best job, Ben Wallace usually comes to the top of them. I'm not sure if Ben Wallace actually has any ambitions in that direction. He certainly had ambitions to be the head of NATO at one point, but that's not happening now. It's back to Jens Stoltenberg. So whether we'll see a resurgence in Ben Wallace's interest in
and as we spoke about on a recent episode, he may lose his seat.
He may lose his seat. The hardest thing to judge when talking to people about this is kind of who's going to be left.
Yeah.
And,
after all the Portillo moments.
Yes, it's quite distorted in that MPs are quite divided as to sort of what scale of defeat they may be looking at. So some are more optimistic than others. So it depends who you kind of speak to about it. Penny Mordant, I think at the minute has, something like a 15,000 majority. But a lot of people who are around Penny would probably point out that she's improved her majority every election. So and that was
she won her seat off Labour as well, which is quite crucial.
Previously was a Labour seat, so if she does hang on to it, she'll have quite a powerful argument to put to MPs and party members. And you do wonder if she may have learnt from some of the mistakes that she made during her last leadership contest. But on the other hand, I think when people are thinking about this question, one of the things that they don't mention is that it kind of depends what the circumstances are in which the Conservative Party may lose the next election and what reasons the public attribute to, the defeat, why they chose to vote against the Conservative Party. Did they lose on the economy? Were there other voters who remained convinced on some of the culture wars arguments? That would favour, for example, Kemi Badenoch. Will the feeling that seems to be on the rise against Brexit and that kind of feeling of regret, will voters take that out on the Conservative Party? And what does that do to the dynamics after the next election? Is it more likely that you're going to have someone who's more of a Brexit sceptic, or has become more Brexit sceptic since we've left the European Union? Does that become a question, or does the party feel frustrated about what's happened, frustrated about losing to the Labour Party, and do they then want to continue campaigning on culture wars issues? That path would favour someone like Suella Braverman or Kemi Badenoch. But you've kind of seen that it's also kind of fraught with danger, that capacity. I mean, like, look at the last few days, for example, big row of the BBC, and then you had Tory MP Lee Anderson, piping up straight away, being very, very anti-BBC and kind of running away with it a little bit, perhaps. It could kind of go many different ways, I think. It's certainly not a decided question. There are a lot of the people that you would speak to would want to tell you that it's a decided question and that, someone like Penny or someone like Kemi is going to run away with it. But I just think that it's so hard to tell at the moment. Yeah,
and there is a danger, of course, in defeat, in reading the wrong lessons from that defeat, as we saw Labour sort of catastrophically did after 2015. And, you can see all sorts of ways that you could read different things from the results. So, someone like Rishi Sunak, obviously he speaks sort of in quite socially conservative terms at the moment, but he's sort of coded as quite a centrist kind of technocratic leader. So if he sort of loses by not as much as expected, or, Labour sort of have to go into some kind of minority or coalition situation, then perhaps that vindicates his style of leadership, and you do get someone who is perhaps from the softer end of the party. If there's a catastrophic defeat, are people going to argue, well, that's because of the way that we presented ourselves as too sort of bland, and should we have a big personality in the style that we had Boris Johnson before, who delivered us that huge win? And perhaps that leans more towards someone like Kemi Badenoch, who is someone who on camera is quite a compelling presence, speaks, so she's sort of a straight talker, and she's also someone who doesn't necessarily row back on what she's going to say. She doesn't pull punches, which, like you say, is a risk, but it's also something that does quite appeal in terms of its presentation style to people.
Yeah, I think that's right. I also think there'll be a big examination after the next election of Keir Starmer as an individual politician and his pluses, because he will become a Labour Prime Minister and not just the Labour leader. So there'll be a big evaluation of why Keir Starmer's won and what's good about Keir Starmer and how his victory has been, in many ways shows his genius or whatever. So they'll be also thinking about how they will oppose him as an individual politician, so then that's kind of more of a vibes thing. So yeah, that it might suit somebody like Kemi Badenoch, or perhaps someone like Penny, who's might have a lighter touch as a communicator and less easy to goad.
Yes. It's very much who you talk to in the party. You'll get completely different answers. If you talk to the sort of One Nation caucus or the moderates, they always will tell you we win when we move to the centre. So they'll look at sort of the Pennies and the sort of One Nation Tories as their future leader. But then if you look at those, talk to those on more of the right of the party, they'll say we need something refreshing, we need something that brings more energy to the Conservative Party. And Kemi Badenoch has consistently been touted as a leader who is very new, very refreshed. She's a positive face, in their words, for the Conservative Party. I think it's going to really depend on what victory for the Labour Party looks like, and not only how Starmer has done and his appeal, but also where the Conservatives had failed. And what I think is quite interesting about Kemi is we've seen a couple of times now in her role as business sec that she has had to row back on a couple of things. So, for example, the EU retained law bill. So her row back on that actually slightly weakened her position as this quite bolshy leader, and it might have slightly, I guess, undermined her, very kind of no nonsense. We're going to go through this. This is the Conservative
And you had
mandate.
some of those classic Brexiteer voices like John Redwood feeling betrayed by that. They kind of thought that she was on the same page and she wasn't. So maybe there's a bit of an alienation of that.
Yeah,
that side of it.
I wonder. And also, she was very kind of strong on the culture war stuff. But if Labour, win overwhelmingly on the economy or just bringing a certain semblance of stability to politics, I wonder how much the culture war will become a factor in the next Tory leadership, or whether it will be what is the perfect, antidote to Keir Starmer.
Yeah.
So it will be interesting to see, and I think it's hard to predict until we know exactly what a Labour victory is going to look like.
Yeah, and of course, the Conservatives can still win. We might have Rishi Sunak until 2030, for example.
Yeah, I was just going to quarrel slightly with the EU retained law bill. As in,
many have.
Yes. As in, I actually think that was a good judgment of Kemi Badenoch to take on the Brexiteers, and I think that might reflect well on her after the next election. I think that might be, in the short term, may appear like it's massively undermined her position, but in the longer term, I think that might.
But then you've always got the members to worry about.
Yeah. But again, everything will look very different after a defeat,
And how much is Brexit going to form part of the next Conservative leadership campaign, or will it be other issues? I think is the key point as well.
And what was interesting, actually, just lastly on this, was the during the Tory leadership contest that we've seen, Kemi Badenoch and Penny Mordant were coming up very high in the polling of party members, although party membership polling can be a little bit difficult to read. But it's interesting because they represented two quite different sides of the Conservative project, but nevertheless, they were sort of popular with the same people. When I went out to go and speak to Tory members at some of the associations, they would say both of those names to me in the same breath, not really sort of reflecting the fact that they have very significant ideological differences. So I think it is a bit of a presentation thing and also a fresh face thing.
It's just so hard to tell right now. I know I'll repeat myself in that respect. It does depend on the scale of the defeat. And you're right, if we could end up with, the Conservatives as the largest party, and I think that's like the maximum chaos option, right? I think that makes it in many ways that might be the worst possible thing for the Conservative Party, because would a party in Northern Ireland do a deal with them? The Lib Dems have already said they wouldn't do a deal with them. They're in a very, very difficult position. They can't do a deal with the SNP.
So it's just the Greens left.
Yeah, indeed. And then
good luck with that.
The internal fighting becomes more intense because you still, in some way, potentially could retain power. It just becomes. But I think that's the most difficult outcome for the Conservatives if they become the largest party again.
Thanks so much for watching. We'd love to know what you think. Please make sure you leave your comments below. And if you enjoyed watching this podcast, you can watch more of our videos on our YouTube channel. And don't forget to like and subscribe.